more accessible to the lower classes than the white Navy wives, who, as it turned out, also came to enjoy deep affection from their students. Though Agata Johnston was not exactly of the lower class of Chamorros to which Reverend Sablon referred, it is important to point out that she was also clearly not of the vernacular or elite Chamorro class, despite the fact that her father was Spanish mestizo. Johnston's social standing, at the time at least, helps us appreciate how Chamorro society was actually more complex than that structured by the stereotypical binary of lower and upper classes. Nonetheless, in the asymmetrical landscape of power relations between the Navy and Chamorros, where the principal binary between native and non-native tended to obfuscate other uneven power relations that flowed, somewhat like the Agana River, along gender and class lines on both sides of the colonial divide, Agata Johnston rose from origins she preferred to call simply humble roots. But Johnston's story also begins to show the complexities and tensions of Chamorro naval relations in not just the formal terms of engagement along the militarized landscapes, in the area of public education, that is, but in what Navy wife Susan Dyer called the small matters, the social spaces, and later performative spaces, which, though less formal, proved nonetheless to have had a profound impact on the construction of new forms of Chamorro consciousness and identity, whose legacy Chamorros have continued to live with today in the post-war years, and especially now in the eve of the military buildup. Incidentally, this is the third time I've mentioned the eve of the buildup as if this is inevitable. Here's one set of terms that needs rethinking. The idea that the buildup is inevitable, or that it is the only way Guam can prosper, or that prosperity can only be measured in terms of military expenditures. On the other hand, it may well be a more financially sound and practical thing to end U.S. militarization as well as patriarchy. For Guam and for America, if we are also so concerned about the American society that many Chamorros claim as their own. Let me return to Susan Dyer. Even before embarking on her philanthropic duty that became the Susana Hospital, Dyer's small duties, as she called it, were spent organizing biannual balls, weekly dinners, frequent dances, and afternoon tea, what I call her palace mixers. Dyer's palace mixers and work with the Guam Dramatic Club were among the first American social spaces that Chamorros would be allowed to enter. In these spaces, naval officers and their wives mingled predominantly with the island's elite Chamorros, the mestizo. But because of specific conditions of colonialism in Guam, such as the perennial lack of resources and manpower, non-elite Chamorros as well as enlisted Marines would also eventually find their way into such spaces. As the social subordinates in the Navy hierarchy, they are still called grunts. They still enjoyed a position of superiority over the Chamorros. Perhaps the social proximity with the Chamorros before World War II and the sacred story of their return during Liberation Day helps better explain why there is such a strong bond between Chamorro men and the U.S. Marines, between Chamorros and the U.S. Marines. The new shared spaces were an unanticipated and even lamented consequence of the colonial project. Dyer described it thus: our society, and she's talking about Guam here, our society is mixed, for in a little place like this, one cannot draw lines too closely. And yet the fact that the mixed society at the same time also caused Dyer anxiety is evident in the more blatant and honest confession in her letter to her cousin Susie about the palace socials. After first bragging about her accomplishment, she was the first to open her home to the enlisted men and Marines at least twice a year for the biannual extravaganza at the governor's palace. she reveals to Susie another reason for doing what she did. And I quote her here. "I could not see why I should open my house, the governor's palace, to the hoi polloi of Guam, brown at that, and not ask decent white men. In the presence of such authority, Chamorro, quote unquote, hoi polloi and decent white men needed each other for their respective roles in facilitating social mobility. Dyer's palace mixers would in fact lay the groundwork for later social spaces between Chamorros and military personnel, into which the Chamorro teacher Agata Johnston would later find herself. Former Governor Edward Dorn, whose name graced a social hall that carried the legacy of Susan Dyer's labor of leisure, also maintained correspondence with the Dyers. Dorn's own legacy is worth recalling here for several reasons. First, he emphatically continued the social work begun by Susan Dyer, which under Dorn's tenure culminated in the Chamorros themselves building and dedicating the hall in his honor. The second reason is that Dorn Hall soon enough became the central space in which Chamorros themselves organized and led socials. Indeed, Dorn Hall would eventually replace the Grand Opera House of Dyer's time to become home to the new Guam Dramatic Club. And the third reason for marking Dorn's legacy is that Dorn carried out the social work and hospital work begun by Susan Dyer, and did so without the help of his own wife, who had been chronically too ill to involve herself in the small matters. Indeed, somewhat like the enlisted Marines, Dorn seems to be an exception in the eyes of the Chamorro precisely because he concerned himself with the small matters. Or maybe it was because his wife was just too sick to do the work expected of her. In any case, though he was the commander of the naval government of Guam, which made him the governor of Guam, he also circulated and allowed for circulation among his subordinates. Insofar as he concerned himself centrally in the traditional roles given to Navy wives, this governor and naval commander was a virtual white woman, a figure whose subordinate position in the domestic scene placed her closer to the enlisted men and the natives within a hierarchy of naval and Chamorro hierarchies. Perhaps this explains the intimacy between Naval Governor Dorn, a Marine named Gautier William Johnston, and our rank-and-file Chamorro teacher, Agata Johnston, who would soon enough take the Johnston last name as her own, and in a way that was supported by Dorn. But before considering her proximity to white men and the question of how her mobility and activities aided and abetted U.S. colonialism, but also expressed a Chamorro interest in progress, a Chamorro form of modernity, it is worth examining Agata Johnston's leading role in promoting beauty culture and organizing shows for military men as cultural performances in and of themselves. Indeed, Johnston's performances and displays of beauty can be linked to patriotism and loyalty during the war and post-war years, which in turn can be linked to an earlier yearning for and investment in beauty culture. In her Chamorrita notes, for example, Johnston recalls a group of Chamorro women of her generation known locally as the Shoe Gang. I think I forgot to turn my alarm clock on my phone. I apologize for that. I'm still on East Coast time, so forgive me. So I like the sound of crickets, now you know. In her Chamorrita notes, for example, Johnston recalls a group of Chamorro women of her generation known locally as the Shoe Gang. She confesses, At the time